Hi everyone, let's work through this equivalent units demonstration problem. Now this demonstration problem is put together to teach you the how and why of physical flow analysis in equivalent units, and we're using the FIFO method. That's first in, first out. So here's the information, and you see that on the screen. The production of what is it, Biena stars, antihistamine products begins in the blending department, and all material are added at the beginning of the process. We're using that word right there, okay? And output is measured in ounces. Now, the production data that they tell us is that at the beginning of the month, there was 15,000 units in process, and they were 70% complete, and the asterisk says that's with respect to conversion cost. They completed 90,000 for the month, and at the end of the month, oh, by the way, the 90,000 was what they completed and transferred out to the next process. Okay, so with respect to conversion costs, okay, so then in the units in process at the end of the month were only 40% complete. So, to summarize, we started off with 70% complete units with respect to conversion costs. Now, since materials are added at the beginning, the material costs are 100% included once they get there, okay? 90,000 were completed and moved out, and at the end we had 30,000 left in inventory, 40% complete with respect to conversion cost. Again, the ending inventory are 100% complete with respect to material cost because all the material is added at the beginning of that process. All right, so what they've asked us to do on this problem, let me slide down, is prepare a physical flow schedule for May, then prepare an equivalent unit schedule for May using the FIFO method. And then the third requirement says, what if 80% of the material were added at the beginning of the process and 20% were added at the end? So there's a little twist there for number 3. But let's take a look at the solution. Okay, so 2 calculations are needed. First, we've got to determine what were the units started and completed. And we use the information that was already provided to come up with that. They told us that 90,000, that number right there, were completed, and then we've got to back off the 15,000 to come up with 75,000. Well, where did that 15,000 come from? The 15,000 was the units in process that were 70% complete at the prior month. So we're not going to take credit for this month for that production because those 15,000 were actually processed in the month before. That's our beginning inventory. So we know that work took place in the prior month. And that's why we subtracted from what we started and completed, and we figured out that there was 75,000 units started and completed during this particular month. Okay? Now, if you wanted to know what units started were, you would take the 75,000 plus the 30,000 that existed in ending inventory. Remember the 30,000? That's the 30,000 they gave us right there. Okay, let's go back to the other screen now. Okay, so now we've calculated these 2 values that we needed. We needed to know units started and completed, and we needed to know units started. Then what you do is you follow step 1, where you determine the physical flow of each department. In this case, we're looking at the blending department. We had beginning work in process that was 70% complete. And again, we know it's 70% complete because they gave that information to us. That's 70% complete with respect to conversion cost, right? Conversion costs are labor and overhead. Then we add in the 105,000 that the units that we started during May, which we calculated above, and we come up with the total units to account for. Then we've got to, if you will, allocate those total units. We know that we started and completed 75,000, just to the left of my mouse there, and 15,000 came from beginning work in process. So if we add the 75 to the 15, we know that the units completed that were transferred out were 90,000, and they gave us that information as well. The units in ending inventory was 30. If when we add those two together, we should equal the total units accounted for that we calculated previously. Okay, let me slide down now. I'll slide a little bit more. Okay, so step 2, we've got to determine the equivalent unit schedule from this particular department, the blending department. So what we do is we list our columns by how we cost the data, one for direct materials and one for conversion cost. We know that we started off with 75,000 units started and completed. We get it from above, and it started and completed for both direct materials and conversion cost. Remember, this is in terms of equivalent units. Then we've got to add the units in beginning work in process. Now, for direct materials, it's 0% added during the month for the 15,000 that was in beginning work in process, and that's because it was added at the beginning of the process, so that would have been the month before. There was no equivalent units completed this month. And then we use the 30% that we would have completed this month. Well, where did the 30% come from? It's essentially 100% minus what was in work in process to begin with. Okay? So let me look back at that page. They told us that the beginning work in process was 70% complete as to conversion costs. That's why we're only going to include the 30% additional work that we did during this month. So that's where that 30% comes from. It's 100% less the 70% that was already completed the month before. So when we do that math, we get 4,500. And then we've got to figure out what about the end units in ending work in process. Well, we had 30,000. 100% gets completed in direct material. I mean, that should make sense. It gets added in the process, and we're talking about ending here. And they must have told us that there was only 40% complete as to conversion costs. And sure enough, they're telling us 40% was complete at the end. So when I jump back to the screen, we take the 30,000 times 40%, and that's our equivalent units for conversion cost. Then we sum down, and we come up with our equivalent units. Now at step 3, we can determine the equivalent units of materials. 75,000 plus 20% of 15,000 and 80% of 30,000 gets us $102,000. All right, now keep in mind this is the hypothetical situation that answers number 3. So number 3 was, they said, what if 80% of the materials were added at the beginning and 20% were added at the end? And we've got a little bit of a different conversion to do for materials. We've got to factor in those various percentages. In my experience, almost all process costing assumes that material gets added at the beginning of the process, even when that isn't the case in fact. What I find is the accounting systems I've worked with, we assumed it all occurred at the beginning for costing purposes, and the argument for using that practice would be it's close enough, and that we wouldn't materially misstate inventory if we use that kind of simplifying assumption. Okay, well, I hope you found this helpful. Thank you.